My name is Adele Butler, and I was 34 the afternoon a stranger handed me a ghost in the produce aisle. I was inspecting the skin of a bruised peach at a King Street grocery store in Charleston. I calculate risk for a living. I'm an actuary. I spend my days building mortality tables, mapping the precise trajectory of human loss into neat columns. I prefer data because numbers lack the capacity to lie. A hand tapped my shoulder. "Your daughter is beautiful," a woman said. I turned around the peach still resting in my palm and told her I do not have a daughter. Her polite smile faltered. "She has been following you since the bakery counter," she said. I looked down. Standing next to the woman was a little girl maybe 6 years old. She wore a faded yellow sundress and scuffed canvas sneakers. I did not care about the clothes. I was staring at her face, the sharp line of her jaw, the specific asymmetric tilt of her hazel eyes. It was a face I had memorized from a lifetime of shared bathroom mirrors and whispered late-night conversations. It was my older sister, Elise, just miniaturized. Before my brain could process the visual data, the little girl stepped forward and laced her small fingers through my free hand. Her grip was tight and practiced. "Can we go home now, Mom?" she asked. My stomach turned to lead. My sister Elise became a mortality statistic 4 months ago. Lymphoma. Our mother, Virginia Butler, orchestrated the funeral with the clinical precision of a society gala. She stood by the casket and told the entire Charleston congregation that Elise had died exactly as she lived the last 6 years, penniless and alone. No husband, no children, just a tragic, solitary end. Yet here was a child holding my hand, anchoring me to the cold linoleum floor. Welcome back to Luke Vengeance, where ordinary women face the people who tried to erase them and answer with cold, hard facts. The families who count on your silence rarely calculate the cost of your revenge. How old were you when you realized your family was your biggest liability? Drop your age in the comments, settle in, and be sure to subscribe. The woman standing beside the child exhaled a ragged breath. She wore a woven lanyard with a state ID badge. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice strained. "I am her foster caregiver, Brenda. She slipped away while I was paying." Brenda reached down to untangle the girl's fingers from mine. As she did, the child shifted, revealing a plush gray rabbit tucked under her left arm. The toy was worn thin, the velvet rubbed bald on the ears. Pinned to the base of one floppy ear was a small square of white fabric. I stepped closer, my eyes locking onto the faded ink. It was a 10-digit phone number, my personal cell phone number. Above the numbers was a single name, Maya. The ink was written in a thin blue slant. The tail of the 8 looped back over itself, failing to close the circle. I did not need a handwriting expert. I knew the penmanship of the woman who taught me how to write it. I stood motionless, the noise of the grocery store fading into a low, static hum. I opened my mouth to ask Brenda where this child came from. I needed to know how a niece I never knew existed ended up a ward of the state. But Brenda did not pull the girl away just yet. Instead, she checked over her shoulder, scanning the aisle. The polite, apologetic demeanor vanished. She leaned in, closing the distance between us, until I could smell the stale coffee on her breath. "I was not supposed to find you," Brenda whispered the words, arriving fast and sharp. "Your mother paid the department supervisor to lose your contact info. She told them Elise had no other living relatives." I stared at her. My mother paid a state agency. Do not trust the agency. Brenda said, her eyes darting toward the store exit. "Check the death certificate." Brenda scooped Maya up into her arms. The little girl reached out for me, her hazel eyes wide and confused. I watched them walk through the sliding glass doors, the plush rabbit dangling from Maya's grip. Most people would have collapsed right there in the produce section. They would have called their mother crying, demanding answers. I do not cry. I assess. I walked out of the store, got into my car, and locked the doors. The South Carolina heat baked the interior, but I did not turn on the engine. I pulled out my phone and dialed the official Department of Social Services number printed on the lanyard Brenda had been wearing. I navigated the automated menus until I reached a county caseworker. I gave my name. I gave Elise's name. I gave the date of my sister's death. I told the woman on the line I had reason to believe my biological niece was in state custody. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that costs money. Ms. Butler, the caseworker, said, her voice tight and defensive. We placed a notification call regarding the minor child Maya Butler 4 months ago, the day your sister passed. I gripped the steering wheel. Who did you speak to? We spoke to the listed next of kin, Virginia Butler. The interior of my car felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. And what did Virginia Butler say? The caseworker sighed, the sound of someone reading a note they despised. She declined custody. She stated the child was illegitimate and taking her in would be a stain on the family name. She signed the waiver of rights 3 months ago. 3 months. My mother had known about Maya for 3 months. She had looked at a grieving child who shared her daughter's face and threw her into the foster system to protect her country club reputation. Then she sat at Sunday dinners and watched me mourn a sister she claimed died alone. I ended the call. I did not scream. I did not hit the steering wheel. I placed my phone in the cup holder and started the engine. Virginia thought she had buried the truth along with Elise. She forgot she raised an actuary. I did not drive back to my apartment. I navigated the grid of downtown Charleston, steering my car toward the glass facade of my firm. The late afternoon sun baked the asphalt, but the air conditioning inside my sedan kept my environment a steady 68 degrees. My pulse remained a flat 60 beats per minute. Actuaries do not experience panic the way ordinary people do. Panic is unpredictable. Panic is chaos. I thrive on structure. When the ground fractures beneath my feet, I build a table and sort the broken pieces into rows. I swiped my security badge at the employee entrance. The office was mostly empty, the fluorescent lights humming a low, sterile tune. I walked to my desk, dropped my keys on the laminate surface, and woke up my dual monitors. I opened my spreadsheet software. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. The clicking sound echoed in the quiet room as I named the headers. Column A for facts, column B for anomalies. Elise was the artist of the family. I was the calculator. 6 years ago, my older sister packed a single canvas duffel bag and left our historic Battery home in the middle of the night. Our mother, Virginia, told the extended family that Elise had moved to Atlanta to find herself. Virginia delivered this information with a tight, practiced smile, the kind she used when a caterer served the wrong vintage of wine. I stayed behind. I built a career assessing risk for insurance conglomerates. I thought Elise just wanted to escape the suffocating weight of Charleston high society. I never calculated that Virginia had forced her out. I logged into the county clerk portal. I know the municipal access codes by heart from my daily mortality assessments. I typed in the name Elise Butler. The system spun for a fraction of a second before the digital file loaded on my left monitor. I clicked the button to request the unredacted version of the death certificate. I scrolled past the medical examiner summary. Lymphoma. I bypassed the attending physician notes detailing her final hours. I stopped my cursor at line 14. Surviving dependents. There it was in stark black courier font. Maya Butler, age 6. Right below that entry, line 15, required the signature of the notifying next of kin acknowledging receipt of the dependent information. I leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. The signature on the digital line was a jagged, elegant cursive. Virginia Butler. The timestamp confirmed she signed it 4 months ago. I stared at my mother's signature, letting the mathematical certainty of her betrayal wash over me. I remembered the day of the funeral. Virginia wore a custom-tailored charcoal wool suit. She arranged hundreds of white lilies around the mahogany casket because lilies photographed well for the society pages. She stood at the podium in front of 200 wealthy Charleston residents and delivered a eulogy about the tragedy of a solitary life. She wept into a pressed linen handkerchief, lamenting that her eldest daughter had left no legacy behind. She played the part of the devastated matriarch to perfection, all while knowing a 6-year-old girl with Elise's hazel eyes was sitting in a state-funded group home holding a worn, stuffed rabbit. Virginia had deliberately erased a child to protect her flawless image. A child born out of wedlock to an estranged daughter was a variable Virginia could not control, so she simply deleted the variable. The deception was calculated, executed, and finalized while I stood in the front row, grieving my sister. I moved my cursor back to the spreadsheet. Under column A, I typed Virginia knew. Under column B, I left the cell blank. If my mother lied about the existence of my niece, I needed to know what else she had buried. I opened a new tab on my right monitor and accessed a skip tracing software my firm uses to verify complex life insurance claims. The database aggregates financial footprints across state and federal lines: bank accounts, lease agreements, utility bills, tax filings. I typed in Elise's Social Security number. I have known those 9 digits since we were teenagers applying for our first summer jobs at a local bookstore. I expected the software to return a barren wasteland, a dead woman with no assets. Elise was supposedly a broke graphic designer living a transient lifestyle. Virginia always claimed she was sending Elise pity checks just to keep her off the streets. The loading bar crawled across the screen, gathering data points. I took a sip of lukewarm water from a glass on my desk, waiting for the zeros to populate. I wanted to see the final months of my sister's life mapped out in grocery receipts and pharmacy bills. I needed to understand the environment Maya had survived in before the state intervened. The system pinged. A list of financial nodes populated the screen. I set the glass down hard enough to rattle my keyboard. The numbers did not match the narrative. Elise was not a transient. The software showed a consistent footprint rooted right here in South Carolina. She had not been living in Atlanta. She had been living 30 minutes away. As I began to cross-reference her utility payments, an automated alert flashed red in the top right corner of my interface. My breath caught in my throat. The software tracks real-time changes to credit profiles associated with the queried Social Security numbers. It is a safeguard designed to catch post-mortem identity theft. The red banner pulsed against the gray background of the application. I clicked the notification. A fresh line of data unspooled across my monitor. A hard inquiry had just pinged my dead sister's credit monitoring profile. It was not a routine background check or a delayed medical billing verification. The inquiry originated from a corporate banking institution. Someone was actively attempting to open a commercial line of credit using Elise's Social Security number. The requested amount was staggering. I checked the timestamp on the inquiry. It had been submitted exactly 12 minutes ago. 3 months after Elise was put in the ground, someone was using her ghost to borrow money. Dead women do not apply for commercial loans. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the dial pad. I had a niece locked in the foster system, a mother dealing in fabricated obituaries, and a phantom entity stealing my sister's financial identity. Column B was filling up fast. I pulled my sedan onto the cobblestone driveway of my mother's historic Battery estate at exactly 5:55 in the evening. Punctuality is a metric Virginia Butler uses to measure loyalty, and I needed to remain embedded in her inner circle. The house stood 3 stories high, wrapped in double piazzas, and flanked by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. To anyone walking past the wrought iron gates, it looked like a postcard of pristine Southern heritage. To me, it looked like a structural liability. I locked my car doors and walked up the brick steps. I did not ring the bell. I let myself in. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and expensive floral arrangements. The air conditioning was set so low, it raised goosebumps on my arms. I found my older brother Harrison standing by the antique crystal decanter in the parlor, pouring his second bourbon before dinner had even begun. Harrison is 36, but carries the frantic, restless energy of a man running out of time. He wore a pastel pink polo shirt and imported leather loafers, playing the part of the successful commercial real estate developer. The reality of his business was buried in ledgers he refused to show anyone. His ventures were notorious for burning through capital, requiring Virginia to write quiet checks to keep his creditors at bay. Beside him sat his wife, Sutton. Sutton is a woman whose entire personality is constructed from imported silk and weaponized manners. She was adjusting a stray fern leaf on the parlor centerpiece, ensuring everything adhered to her strict visual standards. "Oh, Adele Sutton," said her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You wore the navy blazer again. It is so brave how you prioritize comfort over fashion for family dinners." I did not offer a polite smile. I just looked at the exact center of her forehead. People who deal in passive insults rely on social compliance to fuel their behavior. When you deny them a reaction, they falter. Sutton nervously cleared her throat and looked down at her manicured nails. Harrison took a heavy swallow of his drink, the ice clinking loudly against the crystal glass. He asked me how the numbers business was going, his eyes darting toward the hallway. I told him the insurance industry was predictable. Virginia descended the grand staircase exactly at 6 o'clock. She wore a tailored emerald dress and a strand of pearls, holding herself with the rigid posture of a monarch inspecting her subjects. She greeted us with a tight nod and directed everyone into the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set for 4. Sterling silver flatware gleamed under the light of the crystal chandelier. We sat in our designated chairs. I took my seat directly across from Harrison. Virginia sat at the head of the table, commanding the room. A hired server in a crisp white shirt brought out the first course, placing porcelain plates in front of us. Endive and watercress with a tart citrus vinaigrette. The conversation followed the usual safe parameters dictated by Virginia. She discussed the upcoming Heritage Society fundraiser, detailing which social rivals had failed to secure premium tables. Sutton bragged about her interior design committee and their plans to renovate the country club lounge. Harrison spoke rapidly about a strip mall project he claimed was poised to revitalize a dormant commercial zone. He kept tapping his expensive watch against the edge of the table. I ate my bitter greens in silence, calculating the exact moment to introduce my variable. I needed to see their physiological responses without giving them time to prepare a defense. I waited until the server cleared our empty salad plates and poured fresh ice water into our goblets. Virginia turned her sharp gaze toward me, resting her hands on the table. She asked if my week had consisted of anything besides staring at spreadsheets in a dark office. I placed my linen napkin on my lap and met her eyes. "Actually, I have been assigned a very specific case," I said, my tone perfectly flat. "My firm is conducting a high-value post-mortem fraud audit. We are tracing the financial footprint of a deceased individual whose identity is being used to secure commercial lines of credit." I shifted my gaze across the table, locking eyes with my brother. I watched the mathematics of human panic manifest in real time. The color drained from Harrison's face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, rolling down his jawline and disappearing into the collar of his expensive shirt. His pupils dilated. He swallowed hard, the sound audible over the quiet hum of the air conditioning. His right hand twitched, causing his water goblet to rattle against the polished wood. He did not say a word. He just stared at me like a man standing on trap door. His eyes darted straight to Virginia, seeking instruction. Virginia froze. Her upright posture remained rigid, but the knuckles on her hand gripping her silver fork turned bone white. The silence in the dining room stretched tight enough to snap a piano wire. Sutton, oblivious to the criminal enterprise happening under her own roof, noticed the sudden drop in temperature. She hates social discomfort. It offends her delicate sensibilities. She offered a high-pitched laugh, attempting to deflect the tension filling the room. "Well, that sounds terribly depressing," Sutton said, waving her hand dismissively. "Why anyone would bother stealing from dead people is beyond me. Unless, of course, the dead person left behind a mountain of unpaid bills." She took a sip of her white wine, letting her eyes slide toward me. "Elise was always such a financial burden to this family," Sutton continued. "Even at the very end, she expected handouts." I did not react to the venom in her statement. I let the insult hang in the air, waiting for the rest of her thought to spill out. Sutton thrives on filling empty space with words. Honestly, Sutton leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Harrison has been stressed out of his mind, trying to untangle her messes all week. That Mount Pleasant property alone is enough to give anyone an ulcer. Harrison choked on his bourbon, coughing violently into his napkin. Virginia dropped her fork against her porcelain plate. The metallic clatter echoed through the room like a gunshot. Sutton blinked, looking between her husband and her mother-in-law, her artificial smile dissolving as she realized she had just introduced a forbidden topic. My brain processed the new variable in a fraction of a second. The Mount Pleasant property. Elise was a struggling freelance graphic designer who could barely afford groceries. She rented cramped apartments and drove a rusted sedan with a failing transmission. She did not own real estate in one of the most affluent zip codes in South Carolina. Harrison was sweating because he was trapped. Virginia was rigid because her containment protocol had just been breached. I offered a polite, sympathetic nod to my sister-in-law. It must be very stressful untangling all of that, I said, keeping my voice smooth and untroubled. I reached into the pocket of my navy blazer and retrieved my smartphone. Under the mahogany table, shielded by the long linen tablecloth, I woke the screen and accessed the county tax assessor mobile portal. I typed in the name Elise Butler and filtered the search by the Mount Pleasant district. The database loaded in less than 2 seconds. A property deed populated on my glowing screen. It was a single-family home located in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. The appraised value was listed at $600,000. The owner on record was my deceased sister. I scrolled down the digital page, studying the current active status. The ledger listed Harrison Butler as the legal executor of the estate. I swiped further down to the Pending Actions tab. Harrison was not just untangling a mess. He had filed a priority listing request with the county clerk. He was rushing to liquidate the asset. The status indicated an emergency property transfer and sale scheduled to be finalized at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I sat in the waiting area of Pearson Associates at 7:45 the following morning. The law firm occupied the top floor of a restored colonial building on Broad Street. The air smelled of expensive leather and dark roast coffee. I did not choose Julian Pierce because he was a family friend. I chose him because he viewed domestic disputes through the lens of a hostile corporate takeover. He was a shark swimming in a tailored Italian suit. He charged $800 an hour and earned every single cent by dismantling opposing counsels with clinical detachment. Julian walked into the lobby at 10 minutes to 8. He did not offer a warm greeting or ask how my weekend went. He looked at the printed tax record resting on my lap and gestured toward his private office. We bypassed the small talk. I handed in the deed showing Harrison listed as the executor of Elise's property in Mount Pleasant. I explained the timeline. I detailed the emergency sale my brother had scheduled to close as soon as the county clerk opened her window. Julian reviewed the document. His face revealed nothing. He picked up his desk phone and instructed his paralegal to draft an emergency ex parte injunction. The legal mechanism was simple. We were contesting the validity of the executorship based on the hidden existence of a biological heir. A minor child supersedes a sibling in the probate hierarchy. Virginia and Harrison had committed fraud by omission when they submitted the initial death certificate without listing Maya to the probate judge. At exactly 8 o'clock, Julian's paralegal transmitted the injunction directly to the courthouse. The electronic timestamp flashed on the screen. The asset was officially frozen. The pending real estate transfer was dead on arrival. We spent the next 4 hours dissecting the remaining financial architecture of my sister's life. Julian subpoenaed the escrow accounts tied to the Mount Pleasant address. I sat in a high-back leather chair auditing the incoming data. My brother had moved with terrifying speed following Elise's death. He had bypassed standard probate waiting periods by utilizing a specialized fast-track process designed for estates with zero liquid assets and overwhelming debt. Virginia had provided sworn affidavits supporting his claims. They built a paper fortress to ensure no one looked inside the walls. At noon, my cell phone vibrated against the glass surface of Julian's conference table. The caller ID displayed Harrison's name. I did not answer immediately. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension on his end to build. People who are accustomed to instant gratification unravel when you force them to wait. On the 4th ring, I swiped the green icon to accept the call and simultaneously pressed the record button on my screen. Harrison did not say hello. He did not bother with his usual passive-aggressive pleasantries. His voice came through the speaker raw and frantic. "Adele, what did you just do?" he demanded. His breathing was shallow and uneven. The polished commercial real estate developer I saw at dinner the previous night had vanished. I leaned back in the leather chair, keeping my vocal cords relaxed. "I filed an injunction, Harrison. The estate is frozen, pending a full review of the primary beneficiaries." "You have no right to interfere with my duties," he shouted. The audio clipped as he raised his voice. "I am the named executor. I have spent months cleaning up the disaster Elise left behind. Do you have any idea how much debt she accumulated?" I looked at the spreadsheet open on my laptop. I asked him to clarify the nature of the liabilities. Medical debts, he snapped. The oncology treatments, the hospice care, the specialized medications. It is a nightmare, Adele. The creditors are threatening to place a lien on everything. I structured this property sale to clear her name and protect the family from endless litigation. You just destroyed months of delicate negotiations. You need to call your lawyer and lift the freeze right now. I listened to his performance, mapping the lie against the logical variables. Elise had died of lymphoma. Cancer treatments are expensive, but Elise had qualified for state-subsidized health care due to her low reported income. I had pulled the public records an hour ago. The state covered her hospice care. There were no private medical creditors circling the estate. Harrison was fabricating an emergency to justify the liquidation of a $600,000 asset. I let him rage. I listened to the sound of a fist slamming against a desk on his end of the line. I tracked the subtle shifts in his pitch as he pivoted from anger to desperation. He tried to invoke our mother, claiming Virginia's health was failing under the stress of my betrayal. He tried to guilt me for questioning his sacrifice. I did not interrupt. I did not argue with a desperate man. Arguing validates their premise. When his monologue finally ran out of momentum and he paused to catch his breath, I delivered my assessment. "Numbers do not require my permission to exist, Harrison," I said quietly. "The math will reconcile itself in court." I ended the call before he could formulate a response. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. The heavy oak door to the conference room opened. Julian walked in holding a thick manila folder. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just uncovered a structural flaw in a skyscraper. He dropped the dossier onto the glass table and took a seat across from me. "He was not paying medical bills," Julian said, his voice low and steady. Julian opened the folder, revealing a stack of heavily redacted corporate banking ledgers. He had spent the morning pulling favors with his contacts in the commercial lending sector. Harrison ran his real estate development firm through a series of shell companies, shielding his personal liability. But Julian was a specialist at piercing corporate veils. Julian pointed to a highlighted row on the second page. "Look at the maturity date," he instructed. I scanned the numbers. It was a commercial mezzanine loan. The principal amount was $1.2 million. The collateral was a failing strip mall Harrison had purchased 3 years ago. The anchor tenant had declared bankruptcy, leaving the property vacant and bleeding cash. The loan terms required a massive balloon payment to avoid default. The maturity date on the loan was today. "Harrison is drowning," Julian explained, tapping a silver pen against the ledger. "He is over-leveraged across 3 different portfolios. His primary lender issued a notice of default last week. If he does not produce a significant cash injection by the close of business, the bank will seize his assets and force his firm into receivership." I looked at the appraised value of the Mount Pleasant house. $600,000. It was not enough to clear the entire loan, but it was enough to satisfy the penalty fees and restructure the debt. Harrison needed the cash from his dead sister's property to save his own life. But there was a variable missing from the equation. Even if Harrison bypassed me and somehow convinced a judge to lift the injunction, he still had a fatal problem: Maya. The county clerk had the unredacted death certificate. The state of South Carolina knew a biological daughter existed. In probate law, a minor child inherits the estate. An uncle cannot simply sell a house that legally belongs to an orphaned 6-year-old. The title company would flag the transaction the moment they ran a standard heir search. Julian turned to the final page in the dossier. It was a family court docket filing stamped with a priority seal. Harrison knows he cannot bypass the child, Julian said, leaning forward. A minor cannot execute a real estate transfer, but a legal guardian can petition the court to liquidate assets for the supposed benefit and welfare of that minor. I stared at the family court docket. The petitioner names were Harrison and Sutton Butler. Harrison is not just fighting you for the house, Julian said. He filed an emergency petition this morning. He is seeking full, permanent legal custody of your niece. The Department of Social Services occupied a brutalist concrete building on the edge of North Charleston. The exterior featured barred windows and cracked asphalt, reflecting the underfunded reality of the state foster system. The lobby smelled of industrial floor wax, masking the scent of stale despair. I checked in at the bulletproof glass window, sliding my driver license under the narrow gap. The clerk barely looked at me, handing over a visitor badge bearing a thermal printed barcode. I walked down a hallway illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes. The sound of distant crying echoed off the cinder block walls. I reached the designated visitation room. The walls were painted an institutional pale blue, designed to project calm, but achieving only a sterile coldness. A single rectangular table anchored the center, flanked by 4 rigid plastic chairs. I sat down and placed my items on the laminate surface. I did not bring a loud plastic toy or a saccharine greeting card. Children experiencing severe trauma do not need erratic emotional displays. They require predictable structures. I brought a flat tin containing 48 professional-grade watercolor pencils and a pad of thick, textured sketching paper. I aligned the edges of the sketchbook parallel to the edge of the table, waiting for the variables to align. The heavy door clicked open. Brenda walked in, holding Maya by the hand. The little girl wore denim overalls over a striped shirt. Her hazel eyes scanned the perimeter of the room, mapping the exits and assessing the threat level before she ever looked at me. She possessed the hypervigilance of someone who had learned early that the world was an unreliable place. She climbed into the chair across from me, sitting upright. She clutched the same gray plush rabbit I had seen in the grocery store, holding it tight against her ribs. I pushed the tin of colored pencils across the table. I did not speak in the high-pitched cadence adults usually reserve for children. I introduced myself plainly. I told her my name was Adele, and I was her mother's sister. Maya looked at the tin. She reached out and selected a single cobalt blue pencil. She began to draw. She moved with deliberate precision, pressing the graphite into the heavy paper. I watched her form the geometric outline of a 2-story structure. She selected a slate gray pencil for the roof, shading the shingles with steady, sweeping strokes. Then she picked up a vibrant canary yellow pencil. She colored a rectangular door at the center of the facade, pressing hard enough to make the waxy pigment shine against the harsh overhead lighting. "That is a specific door," I said, keeping my voice level. Maya did not look up from her work. "Mommy painted it," she said. "She told me it was a beacon. She said Aunt Adele would find the yellow door if we ever got lost." The statement hit my chest with the blunt force of a physical impact. Elise had known Virginia would try to erase her existence. My sister had engineered a contingency plan, a breadcrumb trail left in the memory of a 6-year-old child, waiting for the day I finally discovered the truth. I looked at the drawing. I recognized the architectural style instantly. It matched the county tax assessor photograph of the Mount Pleasant property. Maya switched to a dark brown pencil, drawing the thick trunk of an oak tree near the porch. Uncle Harrison did not like the door. Maya said, her tone casually conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. He yelled at Mommy about it. The graphite snapped against the paper. I kept my posture relaxed. leaning back slightly in my plastic chair to avoid displaying alarm. "When was Uncle Harrison there?" I asked. Maya carefully placed the broken pencil back into the tin and selected a fresh one. "He came the day the flashing truck took Mommy away," she said. "The ambulance," I clarified. Maya nodded. "He did not go to the hospital with Mommy. He stayed in the house. He was angry. He threw all the clothes out of the hallway closet. He said he needed to find the metal box." The chronological sequence locked into place inside my analytical mind. Elise was dying. Paramedics were rushing her to the oncology ward. Instead of following the ambulance to be by his sister's side, Harrison was tearing her house apart. He was looking for a metal box. Whatever resided inside that container represented a severe threat to his financial survival or Virginia's social empire. He looted the property before the state medical examiner even issued a formal death certificate. He failed to locate the item because he was still desperate enough to file for emergency custody of a niece he actively despised. The legal maneuver was a secondary extraction attempt. Maya finished shading the tree. She set the pencil down and pushed the drawing toward me. She then extended her small arms, offering me the plush gray rabbit. I reached across the table and took the toy. The moment the fabric settled into my palms, my brain registered a severe physical anomaly. A standard stuffed animal of this size should weigh less than 8 ounces. The stuffing should compress easily under minimal pressure. This rabbit felt wrong. The weight distribution was heavily concentrated in the lower torso. The center of gravity was entirely off-axis. When I shifted my grip, my fingertips brushed against a rigid structure buried beneath the synthetic fur. I looked up at Brenda, who was sitting quietly in the corner chair, observing the interaction. I asked Brenda if I could examine the toy more closely, citing a concern about a loose button presenting a choking hazard. Brenda nodded, granting permission without suspicion. I placed the rabbit flat on the laminate table. I ran my index finger along the dorsal seam running from the nape of the neck down to the tail. The original factory stitching was uniform and tight, but near the base of the spine, the pattern changed. The thread was thicker, a slightly darker shade of gray. It was a crude, hand-sewn repair job. Elise was a graphic designer, not a seamstress. I pressed my thumb against the mismatched stitches, pushing deep into the polyester batting. The rigid object shifted. I traced the perimeter of the hidden item through the thin fabric. It was not a metal box. It was a flat, elongated piece of brass featuring a distinct geometric bow and a grooved blade. I mapped the exact dimensions with my fingertips. It was the undeniable shape of a bank safe deposit box key. I returned to my downtown apartment at 8:15 that evening. The air inside smelled of bergamot and cold air conditioning. My living space reflects my cognitive process. Everything serves a distinct function. The spine of every book on my shelf aligns flush with the edge of the wood. The kitchen counters are bare marble, devoid of appliances or stray mail. I do not tolerate clutter because clutter introduces uncalculated variables. I had the brass safe deposit box key resting on the center of my glass coffee table. I had extracted it from the rabbit during the final moments of the DSS visitation, using a pair of small grooming scissors from my purse, under the guise of snipping a loose thread. I was waiting for the morning to visit the credit union. At exactly 9 o'clock, the silence shattered. 3 sharp, heavy strikes against my front door. The rhythm did not belong to a delivery driver dropping off a package or a neighbor asking for a favor. It was the synchronized, authoritative knock of law enforcement. I walked to the entryway and looked through the brass peephole. 2 uniformed Charleston police officers stood in the hallway. The taller one had his hand resting near his radio, his stance wide and braced. The shorter officer stood half a step behind him, holding a heavy flashlight. My pulse remained a steady 60 beats per minute. I ran a rapid sequential analysis mapping the probabilities of their arrival. I had no outstanding warrants. I had not reported a crime. My vehicle registration was current. The only logical explanation was external interference. Virginia and Harrison were making their next move on the chessboard. They needed leverage for the impending custody trial regarding Maya. A family court judge would hesitate to award permanent guardianship to a woman with a documented history of mental instability. They needed a verified paper trail. A recorded police welfare check triggered by an anonymous, concerned citizen would serve as the perfect foundational document in their smear campaign against my character. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open smoothly. "Good evening, officers," I said, keeping my vocal tone low and measured. The taller officer stepped forward, his posture rigid and defensive. "Ma'am, we received a call," he said, his eyes scanning the space behind my shoulders. "An anonymous tip regarding an individual at this residence exhibiting severe distress and erratic behavior. We need to step inside and verify your safety and ensure you are not a danger to yourself or others." I did not block the threshold or demand a warrant. Resistance implies guilt in high-stress scenarios. I stepped back, gesturing toward the open living room. "Please come in," I said. "Let me turn on the overhead lights so you can see clearly." They walked into my apartment. Their tactical boots squeaked against the polished hardwood floors. They scanned the perimeter, expecting the physical manifestations of chaos. They anticipated overturned furniture, broken glass, or a hysterical woman pacing the rug in torn clothes. Instead, they found a sterile, geometric sanctuary. My laptop rested on the glass coffee table, displaying a neatly formatted statistical spreadsheet. A single glass of filtered water sat on a cork coaster. The brass key was now tucked safely inside the pocket of my blazer, hanging on the coat rack. I walked toward the open kitchen, keeping my hands visible at all times. "Would either of you care for a cup of coffee?" I asked, pointing to the stainless steel carafe. "I just brewed a fresh pot of French roast. It is decaffeinated, but it is hot." The shorter officer visibly relaxed, letting his hand drop away from his heavy leather utility belt. He looked at my pristine countertops, gleaming under the pendant lights, and then glanced at his partner. The cognitive dissonance was settling in. The visual data in front of them directly contradicted the frantic, desperate narrative they had been fed by the emergency dispatcher. Virginia was playing a dangerous psychological game, but she drastically underestimated my discipline. She expected me to react with outrage at the intrusion. If I raised my voice to the police, if I began ranting about a vast conspiracy involving my wealthy mother and my desperate brother stealing a child, I would fulfill the exact profile of paranoia the tipster described. The officers would note my elevated heart rate, my flushed skin, and my frantic speech in their official incident log. I refused to hand my family that specific data point. I was the auditor now, and my apartment was passing the inspection with 0 statistical anomalies. "No thank you, ma'am," the taller officer said. His tone had shifted entirely from authoritative command to polite apology. He unclipped his shoulder radio, turning the volume dial down to a low murmur. "I apologize for the intrusion." The caller sounded highly concerned. "They stated you were experiencing a severe emotional break following a recent family tragedy and required immediate psychiatric intervention." I offered a slow, understanding nod, projecting the quiet, dignified aura of a grieving sibling. "My older sister passed away 4 months ago," I explained, my voice steady and entirely reasonable. Family dynamics often become strained during the probate process when assets are frozen. Certain relatives prefer to use public emergency resources to express their private financial grievances. I appreciate you taking the time to check on my well-being. I assure you I am perfectly safe and in full control of my faculties." The officers exchanged a knowing glance. They encounter weaponized police calls in bitter domestic disputes every single day of the week. They recognized a false flag operation the moment they saw the immaculate alignment of my bookshelves. The shorter officer offered a sympathetic smile, adjusting his uniform collar. "We are sorry for your loss, Ms. Butler," he said. "We will note in the dispatch system that this was a false alarm. Have a quiet night." They turned toward the door, eager to clear the call from their digital queue and return to genuine municipal emergencies. I walked them to the entryway, maintaining my role as the gracious, unbothered host. Before they stepped back into the humid hallway, I asked a casual question. "I know the tip was anonymous," I said, keeping my pitch light and merely curious, "but for my own peace of mind, Did the caller specify what triggered this supposed emotional break tonight? The taller officer paused, his hand resting on the brass door handle. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, spiral-bound notepad. He flipped back one page, squinting at his own scribbled handwriting under the warm glow of the hallway light. The caller stated you were relentless and unhinged, he read aloud, tracing the specific words with the tip of his pen. They claimed you spent the entire evening physically harassing your dead sister's landlord. I thanked the officers for their diligence and locked the deadbolt behind them, listening to the heavy click of the metal cylinder. I stood in the silent entryway, letting the final word echo in the quiet space of my mind. Landlord. My analytical framework seized on the glaring mathematical contradiction. Elise owned the Mount Pleasant house. The county tax records I pulled during Sunday dinner proved she was the sole deed holder. Harrison was the legal executor, rushing to liquidate the property as a primary asset of her estate to save his failing commercial loans. You do not have a landlord if you hold the deed to the structure you live in, unless the deed was a fabrication designed to obscure a deeper financial mechanism, unless the house was not an asset, but a meticulously constructed financial prison. Virginia and Harrison were terrified of the brass key waiting in my apartment. They sent the police to rattle my cage because they knew I was getting too close to the source of the funds. My sister was paying someone else for the privilege of living in her own home. The numbers were shifting, and a new target was forming on the board. I retrieved the brass key from my blazer pocket, holding it under the direct beam of my kitchen pendant light. The metal felt cold against my skin. I examined the geometric bow tracing the etched logo stamped into the center. It depicted a stylized palmetto tree, Palmetto State Credit Union, a regional bank with a branch located 3 miles from my apartment. The image of the tree unlocked a dormant file in my memory. The data surfaced crisp and clear. 4 years ago, on a sweltering Tuesday in July, Elise called me from an unlisted number. She asked me to meet her at an independent coffee shop on Meeting Street. She insisted on a location that Virginia deemed too pedestrian to ever patronize. I arrived 10 minutes early. When Elise walked through the door, my analytical baseline fractured. She wore an oversized sweater that swallowed her frame. Her collarbones protruded. Her eyes darted, constantly tracking every customer who entered the establishment. She ordered a black tea, but her hands trembled so much the liquid spilled over the rim of the ceramic mug. She did not explain her physical decline. She spoke in fragmented sentences about needing a secure place to store some old art supplies. While I was looking down at my phone, calculating the probability that she was abusing prescription medications, she reached across the table. She slid a small brass key under a paper napkin and dropped it directly into my open leather tote bag. "Keep it safe, Dell," she whispered, "just in case I forget where I put things." I assumed it was a spare key for a cheap storage unit. Elise lived a chaotic existence, driven by artistic whims and poor financial planning. I went home, dropped the key into the back of a desk drawer, and categorized the interaction as another one of my sister's eccentric episodes. I failed to recognize the variables. I did not realize my sister was handing me the combination to a locked vault. She was building a lifeboat, and she needed a captain who knew how to navigate a storm. I slept for exactly 4 hours. At 8:30 the next morning, I parked my sedan in the lot of the Palmetto State Credit Union. I walked through the glass doors, bypassing the teller line and approaching the customer service desk. A young manager wearing a blue tie greeted me. I placed the brass key on his desk. I explained I needed to access my box, but I had lost my account number. I anticipated a bureaucratic hurdle. I prepared a logical narrative about managing an estate for a deceased relative. The manager simply smiled and asked for my state-issued identification. I handed over my driver license. He typed my name into his terminal. "Right this way, Ms. Butler," he said, standing up and gesturing toward the steel vault door at the back of the lobby. My pulse remained steady, but my mind raced, performing simultaneous calculations. The box was not registered under Elise. It was registered under my name, my identity, my social security number. Elise knew Virginia monitored her every financial transaction, utilizing private investigators to track her debit card purchases. Virginia demanded total surveillance. Elise needed a clean entity to hide her contingency plan. She used the one person Virginia would never suspect of harboring a secret. She used her actuary's sister, the woman who lived a life of transparent, predictable geometry. The manager guided me into the sterile environment of the vault. The air smelled of polished metal and dry ozone. We located the corresponding numbered panel. He inserted his master key into the primary lock. I inserted the brass key into the secondary slot. We turned them in unison. The heavy door clicked open. He pulled out a long rectangular metal container, handed it to me, and directed me toward a private viewing booth. I carried the container into the small, windowless room. I set it on the laminate counter and lifted the hinged lid. This was the specific item Harrison was hunting for the day the ambulance took Elise away, the item he tore her closets apart trying to find. The box contained two objects: a standard black digital flash drive and a thick stack of paper bound by a rubber band. I picked up the paper. It was a stack of canceled bank checks, dozens of them spanning several years. I closed the container and left the bank. I walked back to my car, locked the doors, and turned on the engine to activate the air conditioning. I pulled my laptop from my briefcase, resting it on the steering wheel. I inserted the flash drive into the side port. The drive contained a single audio file, labeled with a date from 2 years ago. I clicked play. The sound of static filled the cabin of my car, followed by the clinking of china teacups. Then Virginia spoke. Her voice was pristine, cold, and laced with refined Southern cruelty. "You will not bring that illegitimate mistake into this family," Virginia said, the audio crisp and undeniable. "You will not parade her around King Street, and you will not contact your sister. You will stay in the house I purchased. You will remain out of sight." Elise responded, her voice thick with tears and fatigue. "She is your granddaughter, Mother. She needs to know her family." The sound of a chair scraping against a hardwood floor echoed through the speakers. Virginia lowered her pitch, delivering the calculated threat. "If you attempt to walk into the Heritage Gala with that child, if you dial Adele's phone number, I will cancel the oncology payments before the appetizers are served. You will die in a public ward. Elise and that girl will become a ward of the state. Those are the terms. Do not test my resolve." The recording clicked off. I sat in the quiet hum of my sedan. Virginia had weaponized my sister's cellular decay. She bought the Mount Pleasant house not as a gift, but as a quarantine zone. She isolated Elise, leveraging life-saving medical treatments against her silence. Virginia orchestrated the estrangement, maintaining her flawless society image, while her eldest daughter fought a terminal illness in a gilded cage. I disconnected the flash drive and placed it in my blazer pocket. I picked up the stack of canceled bank checks. My analytical mind demanded to review the ledger. I slipped the rubber band off the stack. The checks were written from Elise's personal checking account. The handwriting matched the tag on Maya's stuffed rabbit. I looked at the payee line. Every single check was made out to the same entity, Magnolia Holdings, LLC. I studied the amounts: $2,500, $3,000. The numbers fluctuated, but they were always exorbitant. Elise was writing rent checks. She was paying rent to live in a house that the county tax assessor listed under her own name. The police tip about the landlord suddenly made perfect sense. Virginia was not just hiding Elise, she was extracting capital from her. She forced a dying woman to pay for the privilege of her own extortion. But Virginia is a meticulous operator. She understands the liability of a paper trail. She would never link her personal banking accounts to a predatory shell corporation. She would utilize a proxy, a buffer designed to absorb the legal blowback if the structure ever collapsed. I opened my laptop browser and navigated to the South Carolina Secretary of State Corporate Registry portal. I typed Magnolia Holdings, LLC into the search bar. The database queried the state records and loaded the official incorporation documents. I scrolled past the formation dates and the listed business address. I stopped at the designated registered agent field, the entity legally responsible for managing the financial operations of the LLC. The name on the screen was not Virginia Butler. The registered agent was Sutton Butler, my sister-in-law, the woman who sat at the Sunday dinner table, sipping white wine and complaining about Elise being a financial burden. Sutton was not a passive participant in the family deception. Sutton was the architect of the shell company. She was cashing the extortion checks. The variables on my spreadsheet aligned, forming a perfect, terrifying equation of corporate fraud. I drove across the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge, leaving the historic peninsula behind. Mount Pleasant represents a different kind of wealth. The architecture shifts from ancient cobblestone rigidity to sprawling suburban subdivisions and manicured lawns. I navigated the quiet streets until my GPS signaled my arrival. I parked my sedan at the curb, aligning my tires perfectly parallel to the concrete edge. Julian had dispatched a private contractor to meet me. A man named Mike stood by a nondescript work van. He did not wear a uniform or ask unnecessary questions. He simply reviewed my driver license and the court-stamped estate injunction I handed him. He nodded, verifying I possessed the legal standing to access the contested property. We walked up the paved driveway together. I stopped at the top of the front steps. The door stood before me. Maya had reproduced the exact shade in her sketchbook with remarkable accuracy. It was a bright, defiant canary yellow, a beacon painted onto a suburban cage. Elise had marked her territory the only way she could, signaling to the outside world that a living, breathing human occupied this space. Mike utilized a set of tension tools from his utility belt. The deadbolt clicked open in under 30 seconds. He stepped back, returning to his van to wait. I turned the brass knob and pushed the yellow door inward. The interior air smelled of trapped heat and disrupted dust. I stepped into the foyer and surveyed the physical evidence of panic. Harrison had treated the home like a hostile environment. He was searching for the metal box Elise kept hidden, the one now safely secured in my possession. The living room sofa cushions rested on the floor, their seams ripped open. The bookshelves were bare, the novels forming uneven piles on the hardwood. He had pulled every single drawer from the kitchen cabinets, leaving silverware and utensils scattered across the ceramic tile. An amateur searching a space relies on destruction. They operate under the false assumption that tearing a room apart yields results faster. It is an inefficient algorithm driven by pure desperation. Harrison lacked the fundamental understanding of how my sister organized her world. We grew up under the constant surveillance of Virginia Butler. Our mother conducted random room inspections, searching for unapproved reading material or unauthorized purchases. Virginia never checked utilitarian spaces. She viewed domestic labor zones as beneath her notice. Elise and I adapted. We built our sanctuaries where our mother refused to look. I bypassed the ruined home office and the destroyed master bedroom. I walked down the narrow back hallway, stepping over a pile of discarded linen. I entered the laundry room. The space contained a standard washing machine and a dryer resting against a pale beige wall. I crouched on the linoleum floor, ignoring the dust collecting on the hem of my navy slacks. I inspected the wooden trim running along the bottom perimeter of the room. A trained eye searches for breaks in the geometric pattern. The caulking on the left wall was pristine and uniform. The caulking behind the washing machine displayed a microscopic hairline fracture. The paint on the adjacent quarter-round molding was slightly chipped, indicating recent removal. I retrieved a flathead screwdriver from my leather briefcase. I slid the metal tip into the narrow gap between the drywall and the wooden board. I applied slow, steady leverage. The hidden brad nails groaned against the friction before popping loose. The wooden trim fell forward. A dark rectangular void existed behind the drywall. I reached into the hollow space. My fingers brushed against smooth, thick plastic. I extracted a sealed waterproof document pouch. It was coated in a fine layer of white powder. I stood up and brushed the debris from my hands. I unsealed the pouch and withdrew a stack of heavy bond paper. I recognized the official formatting of a South Carolina family court template. I scanned the header printed in bold courier font. Stand by guardian designation. I read the text, absorbing the legal variables. Elise had typed the form herself, but the signature at the bottom was executed in dark blue ink. Beside her signature rested the raised, embossed seal of a licensed public notary. The date stamp indicated she executed the document 3 weeks before she entered hospice care. She knew the end was approaching, and she codified her final directives. Section 4 of the document required the designator to name the primary intended guardian. My full legal name, Adele Marie Butler, occupied the primary line. Section 5 contained the critical exclusion clause. It provided the parent a legal mechanism to bar specific individuals from obtaining custody. Elise had listed Harrison Butler and Virginia Butler. In the required justification field, she wrote 3 precise words: ongoing financial extortion. This was the ultimate trump card. Family court judges prioritized the documented wishes of a deceased parent above all other claims. Virginia and Harrison were currently attempting to paint me as an unstable, estranged relative in their emergency custody petition. This piece of paper destroyed their entire narrative. It proved Elise trusted me implicitly while fearing her own mother and brother. The mathematics of the custody battle just shifted entirely in my favor. I folded the document, returning it to the waterproof pouch. I placed the pouch inside the interior compartment of my briefcase, clicking the brass clasps shut. I left the displaced baseboard resting on the floor. I walked back through the ruined house, untouched by the surrounding chaos. I exited through the yellow door, pulling it shut until the deadbolt engaged, locking the disaster inside. I descended the porch steps, my loafers striking the concrete. The late morning air felt heavy. I reached the bottom step when the sound of heavy tires rolling over asphalt broke the suburban quiet. A dark luxury SUV turned sharply off the main road. The vehicle accelerated up the driveway, crossing the property line and halting at a harsh angle. The front bumper stopped mere inches from the driver's side door of my parked sedan, barricading my exit route. The engine idled. The driver door swung open. Harrison stepped onto the pavement. His face lacked its usual ruddy color, appearing sickly and pale under the harsh sun. His jaw was locked tight, and his eyes tracked me with a frantic, uncalculated fury. Harrison slammed the heavy door of his luxury sport utility vehicle. The sound echoed across the manicured lawns of the quiet Mount Pleasant neighborhood, disrupting the distant hum of a landscaping crew. He marched across the hot asphalt of the driveway. He did not possess his usual polished country club stride. His gait was heavy and uncoordinated, the movement of a predator, realizing the trap had already snapped shut. I stood by the driver's side door of my sedan, my leather briefcase gripped securely in my right hand. The waterproof pouch containing Elise's guardian designation rested inside, safely hidden from his view. I did not retreat or attempt to enter my vehicle. Shrinking away from an intimidation tactic only validates the physical dominance of the aggressor. I leaned the small of my back against the warm metal panel of my car and waited for him to cross the property line. He stopped less than 2 feet away, using his height to cast a shadow over my face. His appearance mirrored his failing financial portfolio. The pastel polo shirt he wore to Sunday dinner had been replaced by a wrinkled dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. The skin under his eyes bore dark, hollow circles, indicating chronic sleep deprivation. I smelled the sour, metallic scent of stale bourbon sweating out of his pores, mixing with the expensive cologne he used to mask his decay. "Call your lawyer right now," Harrison ordered. His voice lacked its customary smooth cadence, sounding raspy and thin. "Call Pierce and tell him to lift the estate freeze." I looked at the pulse beating rapidly against the side of his neck. I did not reach for my cellular phone. I maintained eye contact, letting the silence stretch between us. Silence forces the desperate party to fill the void. "You are destroying this family, Adele," he shouted, a vein bulging near his temple. "I am the named executor. I have legal obligations to settle Elise's outstanding accounts. The medical creditors are preparing to file public lawsuits against the estate. The scandal will crush our mother. You are letting your petty jealousy override your common sense. You need to fix this right now before the damage becomes permanent. He raised his right hand, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. It was a theatrical display of righteous indignation. He wanted me to flinch. He expected the quiet, analytical sister to bow under the weight of his fabricated authority. I placed my free hand in the pocket of my navy slacks. I shifted my weight slightly, calculating the structural integrity of his lies. "There are no medical creditors," Harrison, I said, keeping my pitch even and conversational. Elise utilized state-subsidized oncology programs and state-funded hospice care. The public records are entirely transparent. You fabricated the emergency debt narrative to bypass the standard probate waiting period. His hand dropped to his side. The righteous anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine alarm. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process how much data I possessed. I did not give him time to formulate a new deception. I opened the ledger of his failures right there in the suburban driveway. "You do not need $600,000 to pay hospital bills," I continued. "You need an immediate liquidity injection to satisfy the balloon payment on a commercial mezzanine loan." Harrison swallowed hard. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. "Your flagship retail project in West Ashley is a total loss," I said, reciting the numbers from Julian's dossier with absolute precision. "You relied on a corporate grocery anchor to stabilize the strip mall. That anchor filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy 7 months ago, breaking their lease and vacating the premises. The secondary tenants invoked their co-tenancy clauses and fled. You currently hold a vacant, depreciating asset generating 0 revenue." "Shut up," Harrison hissed, taking a half step backward. He looked nervously toward the neighboring houses, suddenly aware of the acoustic carry of our conversation. I kept my voice low but relentless. "The primary lender issued a notice of default last week," I said. "Your debt-to-income ratio has exceeded the permissible limits outlined in your covenant. You are currently leveraged at a multiple of 8. Your daily penalty interest is compounding at a rate you cannot outrun. You are not trying to save this family, Harrison. You are trying to prevent the bank from forcing your firm into receivership and seizing your personal assets." He stared at me, his chest heaving. The illusion of the successful firstborn son evaporated, leaving behind a terrified man drowning in his own hubris. Virginia had funded his failures for years, but even her deep pockets could not cover a 7-figure commercial default. He had viewed Elise's hidden house as a miraculous lifeline. He thought he could quietly liquidate the property while the rest of the family looked the other way. He never factored an actuary into his risk assessment. "You are a bad investment, Harrison," I stated clearly. "You operate on impulse, greed, and poor statistical models. You view human beings as collateral." I tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase. The leather creaked under my fingers. "And I do not let bad investments manage my niece," I told him. The cold logic struck him with physical force. His shoulders slumped. The tension holding his frame upright seemed to snap. For a brief second, I witnessed the total structural collapse of my older brother. He looked defeated, broken by the sheer, undeniable weight of the mathematics arrayed against him. But narcissism rarely surrenders without a final, venomous strike. Harrison lowered his head, staring at the asphalt. A low sound vibrated in his throat. It started as a dark, ugly chuckle and morphed into a harsh, mocking sneer. He lifted his gaze, his eyes turning flat and cruel. The panic vanished, replaced by a chilling, arrogant certainty. He stepped closer, closing the distance until I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You think you are so smart, Dell," he whispered, utilizing the childhood nickname he only used when he wanted to inflict pain. "You think you solved the entire puzzle because you found a few overdue bank notices." He gestured dismissively toward the yellow door of the Mount Pleasant house. "Keep the damn house," he sneered, his lips curling upward. "Let the lawyers freeze the deed for the next decade. The property does not matter anymore. I already found a better revenue stream." My analytical mind searched for the hidden variable. He was bankrupt. His credit lines were exhausted. The estate was locked. There were no other tangible assets left to exploit. Harrison leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Did you really think I needed a single lump sum to pacify my creditors? Banks love recurring, reliable cash flow, and nothing is more reliable than the United States government." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "I have already secured the monthly federal survivor benefits," he said, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "Elise left behind a minor child. That child is entitled to a very generous monthly stipend from the Social Security Administration until she turns 18. All I had to do was file the correct paperwork, naming myself as the representative payee for her interim care." He turned around and walked back toward his luxury vehicle, his posture newly restored. He climbed into the driver's seat, shifting the transmission into reverse. He backed down the driveway, clearing my exit route. The dark-tinted windows rolled up, shielding him from view as the vehicle accelerated down the residential street, leaving a faint cloud of exhaust in its wake. I stood alone in the driveway, the humid air pressing against my skin. Harrison was not trying to sell the house anymore because he had tapped into a far more sinister vein. He had forged the federal documents required to steal the ongoing survivor benefits owed to an orphaned 6-year-old girl. And he was using that stolen money to service the interest on his commercial debt. I walked to the driver's side of my sedan and opened the door. The parameters of the board had just shifted. The financial crimes had escalated from state probate violations to federal wire fraud. I placed my briefcase on the passenger seat and started the engine. I had a terrifying new equation to balance. I drove back over the bridge, gripping the steering wheel with enough force to turn my knuckles white. The revelation in the driveway reordered my entire sequence of operational priorities. Harrison was not merely a failed real estate developer attempting to liquidate a hidden asset. He was a representative payee executing a federal financial crime. I bypassed my apartment and headed straight to the glass tower housing my actuarial firm. The weekend was over, and the building was active with the low hum of corporate productivity. But I walked past my colleagues without offering a greeting. I locked the door to my private office and engaged my dual monitors. I needed to trace the federal routing numbers. When Julian filed the emergency injunction against the estate, he utilized a broad discovery subpoena. That legal net captured all financial transactions associated with Elise's Social Security number occurring within 60 days prior to and following her documented date of death. I opened the encrypted server file Julian had transmitted and began to mine the raw banking data. I expected to find a crude, linear theft. I assumed Harrison had simply submitted a forged application to the Social Security Administration, directing Maya's survivor benefits into his personal checking account. Arrogant men rarely employ complex security protocols when stealing from vulnerable targets. They rely on the assumption that no one is looking. But as I formatted the data into a chronological spreadsheet, the numbers refused to align with my initial hypothesis. The federal survivor benefits for a minor dependent in this specific bracket amounted to exactly $1,800 per month. The ledger confirmed the United States Treasury Department had disbursed 3 monthly payments since Elise passed away. I traced the electronic routing transit numbers attached to the federal deposits. The funds did not land in an account registered to Harrison Butler. The money was deposited directly into a localized community bank account registered under the name Elise Butler. My analytical mind halted examining the anomaly. A dead woman cannot open a new bank account, and the specific account capturing the federal deposits had been established a mere 72 hours after Elise entered hospice care. Someone had anticipated the impending death and constructed a financial collection bucket. I pulled the signature card associated with the community bank account from the subpoenaed files. The document displayed a jagged, elegant cursive signature. It was an impressive forgery, mimicking the loops and slants of my sister's handwriting. But a forensic accountant looks past the ink and studies the underlying pressure points. The signature on the bank card was too deliberate, too heavy. Elise wrote with a light, chaotic touch. The person who signed this document possessed a rigid, controlled hand. I cross-referenced the forged signature against the digital file of the unredacted death certificate I had saved on my desktop. I placed the two images side by side on my monitor. The forged signature on the fraudulent bank card perfectly matched the specific penmanship of the notifying next of kin acknowledging receipt of the dependent information on the death certificate. The forger was not Harrison. It was Virginia. My mother was the architect of the federal theft. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting the sheer magnitude of Virginia's deception settle into my cognitive framework. Virginia Butler, the undisputed queen of the Charleston Heritage Society, the woman who fired caterers for using the wrong shade of white linen, was committing federal wire fraud. She had forged her dying daughter's signature to intercept a monthly stipend intended for an orphaned 6-year-old. But Virginia did not need $1,800 a month. Her personal wealth was generational, secured in blind trusts and diversified stock portfolios. She viewed government assistance with deep aristocratic disdain. She would never soil her manicured hands with federal funds for personal enrichment. The money had to serve a structural purpose. I followed the outbound transit numbers exiting the fraudulent community bank account. Virginia operated with layers of insulation. She did not transfer the stolen funds directly to her golden child. Direct transfers create a vulnerable legal bridge. She utilized a proxy. The ledger showed an automatic recurring transfer executing on the third day of every month. The stolen federal money exited the forged account and landed directly in the corporate operating account of Magnolia Holdings, LLC. The same shell company Elise had been forced to pay rent to for the past 6 years. The entity operated by my sister-in-law, Sutton. From the LLC, the money was scrubbed, categorized as a consulting fee, and wired into the primary commercial operating account of Harrison's failing real estate development firm. The entire mechanism was a masterpiece of domestic corruption. Virginia was stealing the federal benefits to secretly subsidize Harrison's suffocating interest payments, keeping his failing business afloat. She routed the theft through Sutton's corporate entity to clean the transaction. By manipulating the representative payee forms, Virginia engineered the crime, but ensured Harrison and Sutton held the actual stolen capital. If the federal authorities ever detected the anomaly, Virginia could simply claim ignorance, pointing the finger at her desperate son and his ambitious wife. She made Harrison the fall guy to protect her own pristine reputation. I compiled the documents. I linked the forged signature card to the death certificate. I mapped the transit routing numbers displaying the flow of capital from the United States Treasury through Magnolia Holdings, LLC, and into Harrison's commercial ledger. I created a definitive, undeniable paper trail. I printed the files on heavy stock paper, sliding them into a crisp manila folder. I possessed the ammunition required to dismantle their entire operation. I reached for my desk phone to call Julian and authorize the filing of a formal federal complaint. Before my fingers touched the receiver, the digital display illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID indicated an external mobile number. I picked up the handset, holding it to my ear. "Hello," I answered, my voice calm and ready. Adele, the voice on the other end, cracked thick with unshed tears. It was Brenda, the foster caregiver from the grocery store. I sat forward, my posture tightening. "Brenda, what is wrong? Have you lost Maya again?" "I have not lost her," Brenda whispered, her breathing ragged and uneven. "They took her." My analytical detachment fractured. "Who took her, Brenda?" The department supervisor, Brenda, explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "The state troopers arrived at the group home 20 minutes ago. They had a court order signed by a family court judge. They packed her clothes into garbage bags and escorted her to a waiting vehicle." I tried to stop them, but the supervisor threatened to revoke my licensing credentials. I stared at the manila folder resting on my desk containing the documented evidence of federal fraud. Where did they take her? "They released her to the custody of her grandmother," Brenda said. "Virginia Butler." The equation on my mental whiteboard scrambled. The custody trial was scheduled for the end of the month. The standard legal procedures required home studies, psychological evaluations, and supervised visitation reports before a judge issued a placement ruling. The system does not move a child overnight without a compelling and severe justification. "How is that legally possible?" I asked, my tone dropping to a cold, authoritative register. "Virginia declined custody 3 months ago. She signed the waiver." Brenda sniffled, attempting to compose herself. "Virginia filed an emergency ex parte modification this morning. Her attorney presented the judge with a sworn affidavit from the Charleston Police Department. They logged a highly publicized welfare check at your primary residence last night. The report classified you as exhibiting severe emotional distress and potentially unstable behavior following a family dispute." Virginia had not sent the police to my apartment simply to harass me. She sent them to generate a municipal record of instability. She utilized that fabricated police report to convince a judge that I represented an immediate physical danger to Maya. Virginia leveraged her social standing and my supposed mental decay to secure temporary emergency custody, bypassing the entire investigative process. "I will call you back," I told Brenda, terminating the connection. I placed the receiver down on its cradle. The silence of my office felt heavy and suffocating. Virginia had just extracted a 6-year-old girl from a neutral state facility and placed her inside a historic Battery mansion, serving as the headquarters of an active federal fraud ring. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. I was no longer preparing for a trial. I was preparing for a rescue operation. The state of South Carolina mandates a formal mediation session before any contested custody petition can proceed to a trial docket. The legal system utilizes this preliminary step to mitigate judicial backlog, hoping the warring parties will reach a private settlement behind closed doors. From an actuarial perspective, mediation represents a controlled environment designed to minimize risk and avoid the unpredictable variables of a courtroom. You sit across from your opponent and measure the exact weight of their leverage. The session took place on a Tuesday morning inside a windowless conference room at the County Administrative Annex. The space lacked any architectural charm. Pale beige walls surrounded a rectangular laminate table under the harsh glare of fluorescent overhead lighting. At the center of the table rested a state-issued digital audio recorder. The blinking red light confirmed the device was actively capturing every syllable spoken in the room, creating an official evidentiary transcript for the presiding judge to review. I arrived early alongside my attorney, Julian Pierce. We claimed the seats closest to the heavy wooden door, establishing a subtle psychological barrier to their exit route. Julian wore a dark, tailored suit radiating a quiet, lethal confidence. I wore a structured charcoal blazer and arranged my manila folders in perfect parallel alignment with the edge of the table. 10 minutes later, the opposition entered the room. Virginia Butler glided through the doorway first, treating the sterile municipal building like a private country club lounge. She wore a single strand of imported pearls and a navy silk dress, projecting the image of a benevolent, heartbroken matriarch. Sutton followed close behind her heels, clicking against the linoleum. Sutton arranged her features into a mask of practiced maternal concern, clutching a designer handbag as if it were a protective shield. Harrison entered last. He looked worse than he did during the driveway confrontation. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into bruised shadows, and his hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his chair. They brought a high-priced litigator named Mr. Sterling. Sterling specialized in reputation management for affluent Charleston families. He opened his leather portfolio and smiled at the state-appointed mediator, a neutral official sitting at the head of the table. Sterling initiated the dialogue. He did not waste time discussing the emotional well-being of my 6-year-old niece. He immediately deployed the leverage Virginia had engineered. "We are here today to offer a generous and discreet resolution to a tragic family misunderstanding," Sterling said, his voice smooth and practiced. "My clients recognize that Ms. Butler has experienced severe emotional distress following the untimely death of her sister. The documented police intervention at her residence confirms a deteriorating psychological state. We have no desire to see a respected actuary lose her professional licensing due to a public competency hearing." He slid a single sheet of paper across the laminate surface. In exchange for Ms. Butler withdrawing her custody petition and waiving her legal claims to the contested Mount Pleasant estate, Sterling continued, "My clients will drop all formal inquiries into her mental fitness. Virginia Butler will assume full permanent guardianship of Maya, providing the child with a stable, loving environment. Harrison Butler will resume his duties as executor to satisfy the outstanding debts. The family heals, and the legal maneuvering ceases today." It was a beautifully constructed extortion attempt. They were threatening to destroy my career, utilizing the fabricated welfare check as a weapon to force my surrender. They wanted the house, they wanted the child, and they wanted me erased from the equation. Julian shifted slightly in his chair, preparing to interject, but I placed a steady hand on his forearm. I signaled for him to wait. I folded my hands, resting them on the table. I looked directly at the blinking red light of the audio recorder. Then I looked at Virginia. "I invite you to elaborate on the stable environment you plan to provide," I said, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of hostility. Sterling, interpreting my calm demeanor as capitulation, nodded encouragingly to his clients. Virginia leaned toward the microphone. She delivered a masterful performance. For 40 consecutive minutes, she spun a narrative of devoted grandmotherly sacrifice. She described her deep historical ties to the Charleston community, her flawless philanthropic record, and her expansive financial resources. She wept into a tissue, claiming she only wanted to protect Maya from a lifetime of instability. Sutton chimed in, outlining the private school districts and the pediatricians they had already selected. Sutton painted herself as the eager, supportive aunt ready to step in and guide the orphaned girl. Harrison spoke briefly about his solemn duty to honor Elise by settling her affairs and liquidating the real estate to provide a clean slate for the family. I sat in silence, giving them the floor. In my profession, you never interrupt bad data. You let the flawed models run their course until the entire system collapses under the weight of its own inconsistencies. Every lie they told, every fabricated intention, entered the official state record. They were building a magnificent paper fortress, unaware that the foundation was soaked in gasoline. When the digital timer on the recording device reached 42 minutes, the mediator raised a hand and turned his attention to me. "Ms. Butler," the mediator said, keeping a neutral, measured pitch, "you have heard the settlement offer and the testimonies of the petitioners. Do you accept these terms, or do you wish to present a counterproposal?" I unclasped the brass lock on my briefcase. I did not present a counterproposal. I presented the mathematics of their destruction. I extracted the thick manila folder containing the documents I had compiled over the past 48 hours. I opened the cover and extracted 3 specific sets of financial records, sliding them into the center of the table, right next to the audio recorder. I do not negotiate with individuals engaged in active federal financial crimes. I stated the words, slicing through the stale air of the conference room. Sterling frowned, reaching for the documents. "This is a custody mediation, Ms. Butler," he warned. "I highly advise against throwing baseless slander onto the official record." I ignored the lawyer and focused my gaze on my brother. "Exhibit A," I said, tapping the first stack of paper. "These are the cleared rent checks Elise was forced to write for the past 6 years. Virginia purchased the Mount Pleasant property and charged a dying woman exorbitant monthly fees for the privilege of living in her own home. Those checks were deposited into Magnolia Holdings, LLC, a corporate entity registered to your wife, Sutton." Harrison blinked, staring at the canceled checks, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He knew about the house, but the rental income appeared to be a variable he had not factored into his models. Exhibit B. I continued shifting my finger to the second stack of paper. These are the federal routing transit numbers associated with Maya's monthly survivor benefits from the United States Treasury. Virginia forged Elise's signature to intercept $1,800 a month. I watched the realization spread across Harrison's pale face. He believed he was the sole beneficiary of his mother's financial maneuvering. Virginia had told him she was providing a critical lifeline to save his failing real estate development firm. She funneled money into his commercial operating accounts, framing it as a generous maternal bailout. But Harrison was a developer who understood how to read a balance sheet. His eyes scanned the exact dollar amounts flowing from the stolen federal benefits and the extorted rent checks into Sutton's private LLC. He mentally calculated the total aggregate sum of the incoming capital. Then he compared that total against the meager fraction Virginia and Sutton had actually wired to his business accounts. The discrepancy was staggering. Virginia and Sutton were not simply washing the stolen money to help him. They were skimming the vast majority of the capital off the top. They were charging him a massive laundering fee, keeping the bulk of the extorted wealth for their own private use, while trickling just enough into his accounts to keep him compliant. They allowed him to assume the entire legal risk of defaulting on the commercial loans, while they secretly profited from his sister's death. The color rushed back into Harrison's face, a deep, mottled crimson flushing his cheeks and neck. His breathing accelerated, transforming into harsh, ragged gasps. The polished country club facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. He looked at his mother, sitting frozen in her chair, and then turned his furious gaze upon his wife. "You stole from me," Harrison roared, his voice echoing violently off the cinder block walls. Sterling raised his hands, attempting to silence his client. "Harrison, please lower your voice. We are on a recorded line." Harrison ignored the attorney. He leaned over the table, grabbing the LLC ledgers with shaking hands. He shoved the paper into Sutton's face. "You told me the LLC was a pass-through entity," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You said every single cent from the House and the federal checks was going into the commercial escrow to cover the balloon payment. You have been holding back 60% of the cash while the bank prepares to seize my firm." Virginia slammed her hand against the laminate surface, her aristocratic composure breaking. "Harrison, shut your mouth right now," she commanded. But the dam had already burst. The pressure of the impending bankruptcy, combined with the profound betrayal executed by his own wife and mother, pushed Harrison past the point of rational containment. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Virginia, the red light of the digital recorder flashing mere inches from his hand. "You set me up," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "You forged those federal documents and routed them through her shell company so I would take the fall if the auditors ever looked at the books. You said the LLC was untraceable. You said nobody would ever connect the Social Security money to my business." The mediator sat paralyzed, staring at the recording device. Sterling closed his leather portfolio, his face completely devoid of expression, realizing his clients had just executed a flawless, unforced error. I sat quietly beside Julianne, my hands still neatly folded on the table. In a matter of seconds, Harrison had confirmed his knowledge of the federal theft, acknowledged the fraudulent routing structure, and directly implicated his mother and his wife as the primary architects of the crime. He had confessed to the entire scheme and submitted that confession into the permanent legal record of the state. The mediation was over. The trap had closed. Virginia Butler treats social perception as a literal currency. Following the catastrophic failure inside the county mediation room, she did not consult a criminal defense attorney or attempt to negotiate a plea agreement. She hosted a party. The annual Charleston Heritage Gala represents the apex of the Lowcountry social calendar. She required this specific event to project an aura of untouchable superiority. In her mind, if the elite families of the city raised a glass in her honor, the unpleasantness regarding her estranged daughter and the custody dispute simply ceased to exist in the public record. For Virginia, reality is nothing more than a consensus reached by wealthy people wearing expensive formal wear. I purchased my entry using a corporate sponsorship allocation through my actuarial firm. I did not wear a sprawling silk ball gown or display inherited jewels. I chose a tailored black sheath dress featuring severe architectural lines. My shoes were practical leather pumps designed for steady movement. I carried a thin envelope-style clutch containing my cellular phone and a single sealed document packet. The event occupied the grand ballroom of a restored antebellum exchange building near the waterfront. A string quartet played classical arrangements from a raised wooden balcony, filling the cavernous space with a vibrant acoustic texture. Waiters in pristine, starched uniforms circulated among the guests, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and intricate hors d'oeuvres. The ambient air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, competing against the floral notes of imported orchids arranged upon every available surface. I navigated the crowded floor, mapping the power dynamics of the room. Harrison was notably absent. His unhinged verbal confession during the mediation session likely earned him a strict quarantine order from his mother. Virginia could not risk him unraveling in front of the local politicians and banking executives. I spotted Sutton hovering near the primary bar. Her pristine facade was fracturing under the weight of her impending reality. She clutched a martini glass like a life preserver, her knuckles stark white against the crystal stem. She looked brittle and exhausted. Her eyes darted, tracking the room with the frantic energy of a woman anticipating the arrival of federal marshals. Sutton understood the ledger better than her husband. She knew the shell company linked directly back to her personal signature. I bypassed my sister-in-law and located the primary target. Virginia held court near the silent auction displays. She stood beneath a towering ice sculpture shaped like a swan, radiating a calm, magnetic confidence. She wore a stunning sapphire gown that caught the chandelier light with every subtle movement. She was currently entertaining a small group of local real estate magnates, laughing at a polite joke and resting a manicured hand against her collarbone. I approached her, utilizing a blind spot in her peripheral vision. I stopped exactly 2 feet away, positioning myself within her intimate conversational radius. Virginia turned, expecting another wealthy donor eager to offer praise or solicit a favor. Her practiced smile froze the moment she recognized my face. The muscles in her neck tightened, forming rigid cords under her skin, but her posture remained flawless. She offered a brief nodding dismissal to the real estate magnates, excusing herself from their circle. She took a half step toward me, closing the distance to ensure our dialogue remained private. "You are not on the approved guest list, Adele," she whispered, her voice carrying a venomous subtext beneath a polite frequency. "I suggest you turn around and leave through the service exit before I have private security escort you out for causing a scene." I did not raise my pitch. I did not cross my arms or display defensive body language. I stood perfectly still, evaluating her threat with statistical detachment. "I am standing quietly, holding a glass of sparkling water," I replied, keeping my vocal tone level and smooth. "I am wearing a dress that conforms to the stated dress code. I am not the variable causing a disruption tonight, Mother." A prominent judge walked past us, offering Virginia a warm wave. She instantly flashed a brilliant, welcoming smile, raising her champagne flute in a silent toast. The moment the judge moved out of earshot, her expression hardened back into a mask of pure hostility. "State your business and get out," Virginia demanded, keeping her teeth clenched to maintain the visual illusion of a pleasant conversation. I opened the brass clasp of my clutch. I extracted the sealed manila envelope. I extended my arm, holding the thick paper between us. Virginia hesitated. She surveyed the surrounding guests, ensuring no one was observing the exchange, before she snatched the envelope from my fingers. She held it low against the fabric of her sapphire gown, hiding the stark office supply item from the opulent aesthetic of the room. "Inside that package, you will find a certified transcript of Tuesday morning, I said, outlining the contents with clinical precision. It contains the official mediator recording. It features your son confessing to wire fraud. He directly names you and your daughter-in-law as the primary architects of the theft. He acknowledges the existence of the Shell Corporation and details the exact routing mechanics of the stolen survivor benefits." Virginia squeezed the envelope. The heavy bond paper crinkled under her grip. "You lack the authority to utilize mediation records in a family court proceeding," she countered, her eyes narrowing. "Those sessions are protected by confidentiality statutes. Julian Pierce knows that rule." "Julian Pierce is a family law attorney," I corrected her. "He deals in domestic disputes, but the theft of federal funds falls outside the jurisdiction of family court confidentiality. A crime committed and confessed to during a state-mandated session strips away your legal immunity." I took a slow breath, letting the reality of her exposure settle over the silent auction table. Behind us, a bidder wrote a generous figure on a clipboard to win a week in a Tuscan villa. They were spending disposable income on a vacation, while the woman standing in front of me faced a mandatory minimum sentencing grid. Behind the transcript is a secondary document I continued. It is a draft of the formal complaint Julian is filing with the United States Attorney tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. It includes the forged signature cards, the canceled rent checks, and the corporate registry naming Sutton as the agent. Virginia stared at me, her chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow increments. The ice swan beside us dripped cold water into a silver catch basin. "I am giving you an equation with a single exit route," I told her. "You have exactly 12 hours to contact your litigator. You will instruct him to formally withdraw your emergency custody petition regarding Maya. You will inform the judge that you relinquish all legal claims to Elise's estate, and you will consent to my permanent guardianship. If you execute those steps before the deadline, the envelope in your hand remains a draft." Virginia let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. It was a sound born from decades of unchecked privilege. She looked at me, not with fear, but with profound, aristocratic pity. She believed she understood my fundamental programming. She assumed my analytical nature made me a coward, incapable of executing a fatal strike against my own bloodline. "You are bluffing, Adele," she said, a smug certainty returning to her features. "You are a quiet little calculator who thrives on routine. You lack the nerve to pull the trigger. If you send that dossier to the federal prosecutor, you destroy the Butler name forever. You obliterate your own social standing in this city. You would never risk the collateral damage." I looked into her eyes, seeing the hubris that had trapped my sister in a suburban cage and left my niece in a state-funded group home. Virginia thought the family name was a shield. She failed to realize I considered it a liability. I reached into my clutch and extracted my cellular phone. I woke the screen displaying my encrypted email client. The draft was already composed. The recipient address belonged to the regional director of the federal prosecutor office. The attachment icon indicated a heavy encrypted data file containing every piece of evidence I had gathered. I held the illuminated screen up so the blue light reflected against Virginia's flawless makeup. I maintained unbroken eye contact with the matriarch of the Charleston Heritage Society. I tapped the send icon. The application emitted a soft chime, confirming the transmission was successful. The data was gone, traveling through the cellular network to land on a federal server. The 12-hour window was a courtesy I never intended to honor. The family court building resides adjacent to the county jail, projecting an architectural severity appropriate for the disputes settled within its walls. I walked through the metal detectors at 8:30 in the morning, holding my leather briefcase tightly against my side. The air conditioning pumped a sterile chill through the marble corridors, filtering out the oppressive humidity of the Charleston summer. Julian Pierce walked beside me, his expensive leather shoes striking a rhythmic cadence against the polished stone floor. We reached courtroom 4B. The heavy wooden double doors stood propped open, waiting for the designated docket time. I walked inside and surveyed the theater of my final calculation. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and old wood. The gallery benches, arranged in parallel rows behind the wooden partition, were entirely empty. Custody hearings involving minors remain closed to the general public to protect the privacy of the child. There was no audience to witness the impending demolition. Virginia lacked her usual chorus of wealthy society friends. She was operating without her primary defense mechanism. I took my seat at the petitioner table on the right side of the aisle. I unpacked my briefcase, aligning the manila folders parallel to the edge of the dark oak surface. Julian sat beside me, opening his legal pad and uncapping a silver fountain pen. At exactly 9 o'clock, the opposition filed into the room. Virginia wore a modest charcoal suit devoid of any jewelry. She had discarded the flawless society matriarch persona, replacing it with the image of a humble, grieving grandmother. She walked with a slight engineered stoop, holding a crumpled tissue in her left hand. Harrison followed closely behind her, his appearance deteriorating further. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and his hands exhibited a faint, constant tremor. Sutton was absent. The revelation of the federal complaint transmission at the gala had likely triggered an immediate structural collapse within their marriage. A woman like Sutton abandons a sinking ship the moment the water breaches the hull. Mr. Sterling, their high-priced litigator, directed them to the respondent table. He organized his expansive files, his face tight and severe. He understood the lethal nature of the email I had dispatched to the federal prosecutor. But the wheels of the federal justice system turned slowly, grinding through bureaucratic layers before issuing formal indictments. Until the federal marshals arrived with handcuffs, Sterling had an obligation to execute his designated legal strategy. He had to win the custody battle today, using whatever procedural leverage remained. The bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding authority. Judge Catherine Miller took the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s possessing a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her reading glasses and called the docket number initiating the formal proceedings. Sterling stood approaching the central podium. He launched his opening argument, launching an aggressive, localized strike against my character. He could not contest the financial evidence because the federal investigation was currently pending. He relied entirely on subjective character assassination, framing me as an unfit guardian based on my psychological profile. Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice resonating with practiced solemnity. We are dealing with a deeply tragic family situation. A child has lost her mother and requires immediate stability, warmth, and emotional nurturing. Adele Butler is an actuary. She views the world through a lens of rigid statistical probability. She lacks the fundamental capacity for empathy required to raise a grieving 6-year-old girl. We submit the recent police welfare check as documented evidence of her severe emotional detachment and inability to cope with spontaneous human variables. We ask the court to place Maya in the loving, experienced hands of her grandmother, Virginia Butler. Sterling painted a portrait of a cold, calculating machine. He described my immaculate apartment as a sterile holding cell. He characterized my calm demeanor as evidence of sociopathic isolation. I sat beside Julian, completely motionless. I did not shake my head in denial or display defensive anger. Outrage would only validate his argument. I let him construct a fragile house of cards based entirely on subjective emotional interpretations. Sterling called Virginia to the witness stand. My mother walked to the elevated wooden box, placing her hand on the Bible and swearing an oath to tell the truth. She sat down, adjusting the microphone. The performance commenced. Virginia wept. The tears were real, summoned by her terrifying realization that her social empire was currently crumbling under a federal inquiry. But she repurposed the fear, framing it as maternal grief. Adele has always been distant, Virginia sobbed, dabbing the corner of her eye with the tissue. Since she was a little girl, she preferred numbers to people. When Elise passed away, Adele did not shed a single tear. She retreated into her spreadsheets. She is incapable of forming genuine human connections. Maya is a vibrant little girl who needs a real family. She needs a home filled with love and laughter, not a cold, silent apartment managed by a woman who views her as a logistical burden. Virginia looked directly at Judge Miller, projecting an aura of desperate, begging vulnerability. "Please, Your Honor," Virginia pleaded, her voice cracking perfectly on the final syllable. "Do not let my granddaughter become another forgotten variable in Adele's cold equations." Sterling concluded his direct examination, thanking his client and returning to his table. He looked satisfied, having successfully injected a massive dose of emotional bias into the judicial record. Judge Miller turned her attention to the petitioner table. "Mr. Pierce," she said, peering over the rim of her glasses, "you may proceed with your cross-examination." Julian stood buttoning his suit jacket. He did not grab a notepad or reference a legal brief. He picked up a single manila folder from our table. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, his shoes echoing in the silent courtroom. Julian did not ask Virginia about my childhood. He did not request clarification regarding my supposed emotional isolation. He bypassed the subjective character attacks entirely. He engaged the hard data. Mrs. Butler, Julian began, his tone courteous but firm. You have just testified under oath that your primary concern is the stability and welfare of your granddaughter Maya. Yes, Virginia replied, maintaining her fragile persona. That is my only concern. Julian opened the manila folder. He extracted a single sheet of paper encased in a protective plastic sleeve. He approached the bailiff, handing the document over for official submission into the evidentiary record. Your Honor, I am presenting Exhibit D, Julian announced, turning to address the bench. This is a certified copy of a signature card used to open a localized community bank account 72 hours after the deceased Elise Butler entered a palliative hospice facility. This specific account was utilized to intercept and capture the monthly federal survivor benefits owed directly to the minor child in question. Julian retrieved the document from the bailiff and walked toward the witness box holding the plastic sleeve directly in front of Virginia. The air in the courtroom grew heavy. Virginia stared at the paper. The jagged, elegant, cursive signature she had forged mimicked her dead daughter's handwriting flawlessly. But she knew the forensic analysis I had compiled linked the pen pressure directly back to her own hand. Mrs. Butler, Julian asked, stepping back and projecting his voice so every word landed on the official court recording device, you are currently under the penalty of perjury in a court of law. I am asking you to look at Exhibit D and identify the individual who forged the signature of your deceased daughter on federal banking documents in order to steal funds intended for the very child you claim to love. Virginia stared at the piece of paper encased in the clear plastic sleeve. The silence in courtroom 4B thickened, turning the sterile air into a suffocating weight. She opened her mouth, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The meticulously crafted persona of the grieving grandmother fractured under the harsh fluorescent lights, revealing the terrified architect of a federal crime beneath the surface. Mr. Sterling shot up from the respondent table, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward. "Objection, Your Honor," Sterling shouted, his voice tight with panic. Counsel is attempting to ambush my client with unverified financial documents that fall far outside the scope of a standard family court custody proceeding. Judge Miller did not look at the defense attorney. She kept her sharp gaze fixed entirely on Virginia. Overruled, Mr. Sterling, the judge stated, her tone carrying the density of solid iron. The petitioner has entered a sworn affidavit claiming the respondent presents a stable and secure environment for a minor ward of the state. If the respondent is utilizing fraudulent banking instruments to intercept federal funds intended for that same minor, the documentation is highly relevant to her fitness as a guardian. The witness will answer the question. Virginia swallowed, her throat working in a slow, difficult motion. She looked at Julian Pierce and then glanced toward her son sitting at the defense table. Harrison refused to meet her eyes. He stared down at his own trembling hands, realizing the blast radius of her exposure was about to consume them both. It was an administrative necessity, Virginia whispered, her voice lacking all of its previous aristocratic resonance. Elise was incapacitated. I was merely streamlining the bureaucratic process to ensure the child received her proper care. Julian did not badger her or demand a louder confession. He simply nodded, letting her weak justification hang in the quiet room. He retrieved the exhibit and handed it to the court clerk. "No further questions, Your Honor," Julian said, returning to his seat. Judge Miller instructed Virginia to step down. My mother walked back to the defense table, her posture slumping. She looked like a woman who had aged a decade in the span of 5 minutes. Julian stood again and called me to the witness stand. I walked to the elevated wooden box. The bailiff administered the oath. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. I sat down and adjusted the microphone. I did not produce a crumpled tissue. I did not engineer a subtle tremor in my voice or attempt to simulate tears. I maintained my standard resting heart rate. I approached the testimony the same way I approach a high-risk mortality table. I gathered the variables, and I let the mathematics speak. Ms. Butler, Julian began resting his hands on the petitioner table. You are requesting permanent legal guardianship of your niece, Maya. Upon what foundational legal document do you base this claim? "I present Exhibit A," I replied, my voice clear and projecting evenly across the empty gallery. Julian handed the judge the waterproof pouch I had extracted from behind the baseboard of the yellow door. Judge Miller opened the seal and reviewed the heavy bond paper. "That is a standby guardian designation," I explained, narrating the text the judge was currently reading. It was executed and notarized by my sister Elise Butler 3 weeks prior to her admission into a palliative hospice facility. Section 4 designates me as the sole intended guardian. Julian paced a slow, tight circle near his table. "Does that document contain any specific exclusionary clauses regarding the placement of the child?" "It does," I confirmed. Section 5 contains a deliberate exclusion barring Virginia Butler and Harrison Butler from obtaining any form of custody or supervisory access. In the required justification field, the deceased parent cited ongoing financial extortion. Sterling stood up, raising his hand. "Objection, Your Honor. The deceased sister was heavily medicated during her final weeks. We cannot verify her state of mind when she drafted that subjective accusation." Judge Miller lowered the document, peering over her reading glasses at the defense attorney. "A state-licensed notary verified her identity and her competency at the time of signing, Mr. Sterling," the judge countered. "I will accept the designation into evidence." Overruled. Julian moved to the next variable. "Ms. Butler," he said, tapping his silver pen against a fresh manila folder, "can you elaborate on the financial extortion cited by the deceased?" I turned my head and looked directly at Harrison. "I present Exhibit B and Exhibit C," I stated. Julian delivered the thick stacks of banking ledgers to the bench. I did not rush the explanation. I guided the court through the architecture of the theft step by step. I detailed the inbound routing numbers originating from the United States Treasury. I mapped the flow of the stolen survivor benefits landing in the forged community bank account. I explained how the funds were subsequently wired into Magnolia Holdings, LLC. I identified Sutton Butler as the registered agent of the Shell Corporation. I presented the canceled rent checks, proving Elise was forced to pay thousands of dollars a month to reside in a property registered under her own name. Finally, I traced the outbound consulting fees exiting the LLC and dropping directly into the commercial operating ledgers of Harrison's failing real estate firm. These individuals did not offer a safe harbor for a dying woman, I told the court. They operated a predatory extraction mechanism. They utilized the threat of withholding oncology treatments to enforce compliance. Sterling jumped to his feet, his face flushed. "Objection! That is a scandalous and unfounded accusation based on hearsay." Julianne approached the clerk holding the small black flash drive I had recovered from the safe deposit box. "Your Honor, the petitioner requests permission to enter an audio file into the record. It was secured by the deceased prior to her passing." Judge Miller granted the request. The clerk inserted the drive into the court terminal. The audio fed through the mounted ceiling speakers. The quiet room filled with the acoustic reality of my mother's cruelty. Virginia's pristine voice echoed off the marble walls, delivering the fatal ultimatum. "You will die in a public ward. Elise and that girl will become a ward of the state. Those are the terms. Do not test my resolve." The recording ended, leaving a chilling, static hiss in its wake. I looked at Judge Miller. Her jaw was set tight, her facial features hardening into a mask of pure judicial disgust. She looked at the defense table as if she were inspecting a hazardous biological spill. "I do not view my family as evil," I said, delivering my final assessment to the silent room. "Evil is a subjective, emotional concept. I evaluate risk. My mother and my brother are financially compromised. They carry overwhelming commercial debt and exhibit zero ethical restraints regarding the acquisition of capital. They are legally disqualified to serve as fiduciaries for a minor dependent. Allowing them access to Maya represents an unacceptable, catastrophic risk." The clinical detachment of my statement broke whatever fragile restraint Virginia had left. The matriarch of the Charleston Heritage Society could not tolerate being reduced to a flawed statistic. The control shattered. Virginia shot up from her chair, knocking the heavy oak seat backward. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide and manic. "Stop being dramatic," Adele Virginia screamed, her voice cracking, echoing shrill and desperate across the courtroom. "You always exaggerate everything. We were protecting the family. We were managing a crisis. You are blowing a simple administrative arrangement entirely out of proportion." The phrase landed like a heavy stone. Stop being dramatic. She had used those exact words to gaslight me my entire life. She used them to cover her tracks, to silence my questions, to invalidate my reality. But she forgot she was not standing in her formal dining room anymore. She was standing in a court of law, and her favorite weapon had just transformed into a profound, unforced confession. Judge Miller struck her wooden gavel against the sound block. The sharp crack severed Virginia's hysterical rant. "Sit down, Mrs. Butler," the judge commanded, her voice echoing with lethal authority. "If you utter one more word in my courtroom, I will hold you in summary contempt and order the bailiff to place you in holding." Virginia froze, her arms still suspended in the air. She looked at the bailiff, who had already unhooked the retaining strap on his utility belt and taken 2 steps toward the defense table. She slowly lowered her hand and sank back into her chair, defeated. Judge Miller did not require closing arguments. She arranged the submitted exhibits into a neat stack and folded her hands over the documents. "I have presided over family disputes in this county for 19 years, the judge stated, scanning the defense table. "I have rarely witnessed a display of domestic corruption as thorough and calculated as the evidence presented here today. The emergency custody order granted to Virginia Butler is hereby vacated immediately." The judge shifted her gaze to me, her expression softening by a fraction of a degree. "Permanent legal and physical custody of the minor child, Maya Butler, is awarded to the petitioner, Adele Butler." I let out a slow, steady exhale. The math had finally balanced. But Judge Miller was not finished. She picked up the forged signature card and the LLC routing ledgers. "This court maintains a strict jurisdictional boundary regarding domestic relations," the judge continued, her tone dropping back into a severe register. "However, when a party submits documented evidence of active federal wire fraud and the theft of United States Treasury funds utilizing a minor ward of this state as a conduit, I possess a mandatory ethical obligation to intervene." Judge Miller looked directly at Harrison. He had curled into himself, shrinking away from the bench. "Mr. Butler," the judge said, "the financial ledgers submitted today indicate you are the primary recipient of stolen federal capital. Given the severity of the flight risk associated with your impending commercial bankruptcy, I am not waiting for the federal prosecutor to issue a summons." Judge Miller looked at the armed deputy standing near the gallery partition. "Bailiff," the judge ordered, "execute a bench warrant for Harrison Butler. Take him into custody pending transfer to the Federal Marshal's Service." The courtroom erupted into frantic motion. Sterling backed away from his client, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. Virginia gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth as the bailiff approached her golden child. Harrison did not fight. He stood up slowly, offering his wrists. The distinct metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking into place echoed through the room, serving as the final, definitive period at the end of their long, fabricated sentence. 3 months passed. The chaotic variables stabilized, transitioning into a predictable, sustainable pattern. In my profession, a 90-day post-event analysis provides a clear picture of long-term viability. The structural damage sustained by my biological family proved terminal. The facade they spent decades meticulously maintaining collapsed under the sheer weight of its own internal fraud. The federal wheels turned with brutal efficiency once Julian transmitted the comprehensive dossier. The United States Attorney for the District of South Carolina did not offer a polite settlement. They secured a grand jury indictment against Harrison for wire fraud, identity theft, and the misappropriation of federal Treasury funds. Harrison currently resides in a federal holding facility awaiting his trial date. The commercial lenders executed their default clauses, seizing his vacant retail properties and forcing his development firm into involuntary bankruptcy. The golden child was stripped of his pastel polos and his imported leather loafers, facing a mandatory minimum sentence measured in years, not months. Sutton reacted exactly as the actuarial models predicted. She is a creature governed by self-preservation and the acquisition of capital. The moment the federal agents froze the commercial accounts and initiated the asset seizure protocols, Sutton filed for an expedited divorce. She claimed total ignorance regarding the LLC operations, citing her role as a mere passive signatory manipulated by a domineering husband. She traded her marriage for a reduced immunity plea deal, slipping away from the blast radius to find a new host to parasitize. Virginia experienced a different kind of incarceration. She did not face handcuffs or a prison cell. She faced a complete and total social execution. The Charleston Heritage Society operates on a strict, unwritten code of conduct. They tolerate infidelity, substance abuse, and quiet divorces, but they do not tolerate public, federal indictments and the theft of funds from an orphaned child. The scandal bled into the local papers. Virginia was systematically purged from her environment. She received polite, sterile letters from the philanthropic boards and the country club asking for her immediate resignation. Her phone stopped ringing. The invitations ceased. The financial blow proved equally devastating. To cover Harrison's mounting legal defense fees and satisfy the initial restitution demands required by the federal prosecutor, Virginia was forced to liquidate her primary asset. She sold the historic Battery home. The grand three-story estate with the double piazzas and the ancient oak trees was purchased by a tech executive from California who immediately painted over the original woodwork. Virginia relocated to a modest condominium in a secondary suburb, living a life defined by silence and the whispers of her former peers. I do not check on them. I do not monitor the public dockets or drive past the condominium to assess my mother's decline. When an account is reconciled and closed, you do not reopen the ledger. The negative variables have been permanently isolated and removed from my operational environment. My environment is now located across the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge. I am standing in the kitchen of the Mount Pleasant house. The oppressive, stifling heat of the late summer has surrendered to the crisp, clear air of a South Carolina autumn. The physical remnants of Harrison's frantic search have been repaired and replaced. I hired a specialized contractor to restore the torn drywall and replace the damaged baseboards. I purchased new furniture, prioritizing comfort and durability over rigid aesthetic perfection. The sterile geometric precision of my downtown apartment did not translate well to a suburban home requiring a softer, more flexible architecture. The front door remains canary yellow. I did not paint over it. I hired a professional to apply a fresh coat of high-gloss enamel, ensuring the beacon Elise created remained vibrant and visible from the street. It stands as a daily reminder of the contingency plan she engineered to save her daughter. I walked to the kitchen island holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. Maya sat on a tall wooden stool pulled close to the granite counter. She wore denim overalls and a bright green long-sleeve shirt, her canvas sneakers hooking onto the bottom rung of the stool. She possessed the kinetic energy of a healthy, secure 6-year-old. The hypervigilance she displayed during our initial supervised visitation had slowly evaporated, replaced by a relaxed, unbothered curiosity. She held a bright orange-colored pencil, pressing the waxy pigment into a thick sketch pad. She was no longer drawing houses with yellow doors or mapping escape routes. She was drawing a sprawling, chaotic garden filled with abstract flowers and a highly inaccurate rendering of a golden retriever we saw walking in the neighborhood earlier that morning. I set my coffee mug down, resting my elbows on the cool stone counter. I watched her work. She paused her shading, tilting her head to the left to evaluate the symmetry of the drawing. The specific asymmetric tilt of her hazel eyes mirrored Elise perfectly. The biological data transfer was undeniable, an exact replica of my sister living and breathing in my kitchen. Maya set the orange pencil down and reached for a small carton of apple juice resting near her sketchbook. She peeled back the foil tab and took a long, steady sip. She lowered the carton and looked across the granite island, meeting my gaze. "Can we go to the park now, Mom?" she asked. She did not ask the question with the desperate, urgent cadence she utilized in the produce aisle of the King Street grocery store. She did not ask the question seeking a sudden rescue from an unstable environment. She asked with the casual expectation of a child requesting a routine Saturday afternoon activity. And she did not ask to go home anymore. When you spend your entire life building mortality tables and calculating the precise geometry of risk, you learn to recognize when a system finally achieves perfect equilibrium. The variables align, the columns lock into place, and the foundation holds firm against external pressure. I looked at the little girl sitting in the bright kitchen. I reached across the island and tapped my finger lightly against the nose of the abstract golden retriever she had drawn. "Yes, we can go to the park," I answered. She smiled, sliding off the wooden stool and running down the hallway to retrieve her sneakers. I picked up my coffee mug and took a sip. I spent 34 years operating under the false assumption that silence equated to weakness. My family believed my analytical detachment rendered me a coward. They thought my inability to perform dramatic emotional outbursts meant I lacked the capacity to fight back. They underestimated the structural power of patience. They failed to realize that outrage is a temporary fuel, but logic is an infinite resource. Quiet people do not lose. We do not surrender when the noise becomes overwhelming, and we do not retreat when the initial calculations look bleak. We simply step back, observe the patterns, and wait for the precise mathematical moment to present the receipt. When you spend your professional life evaluating risk and constructing mortality tables, you develop a unique perspective on what humans leave behind. Most people believe their legacy resides in the physical assets they accumulate. They focus on the real estate, the investment portfolios, and the carefully curated social standing they project to the world. But standing in the quiet kitchen of the Mount Pleasant house, watching a 6-year-old girl draw vibrant gardens in a sketchbook, I realized the profound inadequacy of that metric. The true ledger of a human life is not tallied in bank accounts. It is measured in the emotional architecture we build for the next generation. The ordeal with my mother, Virginia, and my brother, Harrison, exposed a toxic fracture prevalent in modern American culture. We live in a society that frequently confuses the appearance of success with the presence of virtue. Virginia constructed a flawless traditional family structure on the surface. She possessed the historic Battery home, the country club memberships, and the pristine civic reputation. From the outside, we were the quintessential American dream. But a facade offers no structural integrity during a storm. Virginia treated her children not as individuals requiring guidance, but as extensions of her own ego. Harrison became her golden investment, funded and protected as long as he maintained the illusion of the successful businessman. Elise became a liability discarded and erased the moment her life deviated from the approved social script. Parenting based on conditional love is not parenting at all. It is a transactional arrangement. When we prioritize the family name over the truth we teach our children, that their worth is entirely dependent on their performance. Harrison learned this lesson too well. He internalized the belief that failure was fatal, leading him to execute federal fraud rather than admit he needed help. His moral compass was warped by a mother who valued aesthetics over honesty. He was taught to hide his flaws behind pastel shirts and imported leather loafers. Raising a child requires an unwavering commitment to reality. Fairness and honesty are not merely ethical concepts, they are the foundational pillars of psychological safety. Elise understood this fundamental truth even as her physical body failed her. She knew she could not offer Maya a life of immense wealth or aristocratic privilege. Instead, she offered her daughter the truth. She painted a canary yellow door to serve as a beacon. She sewed a safe deposit box key into a stuffed rabbit. She engineered a survival plan rooted in undeniable facts. Elise demonstrated the purest form of family responsibility by ensuring her child would eventually find her way to a safe harbor. Emotional awareness in parenting does not mandate loud, dramatic displays of affection. For a long time, I believed my analytical nature rendered me emotionally deficient. I assumed my inability to perform theatrical grief or public outrage made me a flawed human being. Virginia weaponized that trait, calling me cold and distant. But true emotional intelligence is the capacity to recognize what a child actually needs and possessing the discipline to provide it consistently. A traumatized child does not need a parent who matches their chaos. They need a steady, unshakable anchor. They need someone who will sit quietly at a laminate table and slide a box of colored pencils across the surface, offering structure in a shattered world. In American culture, we often feel the pressure to shield our children from every conceivable hardship. We want to construct perfect, pain-free environments. But authentic, long-term guidance involves teaching a child how to navigate the inevitable fractures of life. It requires us to show them that justice is not a loud, chaotic brawl. Justice is a quiet, meticulous process of gathering the truth and waiting for the right moment to present the receipt. We must teach the next generation that their voices hold power, even when they do not shout. We must demonstrate that traditional family values are not defined by remaining silent to protect an abuser. True traditional values are defined by loyalty to the truth, the protection of the vulnerable, and the courage to sever toxic ties when the foundation turns to rot. Every family possesses a ledger. Some columns are filled with warmth, support, and quiet sacrifices. Other columns hold the dark weight of generational trauma, unspoken resentments, and inherited debts. The most critical responsibility we bear as adults is the auditing of that specific ledger. We must decide which traits we carry forward and which cycles we actively terminate. We have the power to stop the bleeding and repaint the door. If this journey resonated with the quiet battles you are fighting within your own lineage, you are not alone. There is a profound strength in remaining steady while the people around you unravel. We document these experiences to remind you that cold, hard facts will always outlast a fabricated narrative. Please subscribe and follow the Luck Vengeance channel to join a community of individuals who understand that true justice does not require a microphone. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know how you are repainting the doors in your own life. As I watch Maya finish her drawing, setting her orange pencil down to inspect her work, I think about the years stretching out ahead of us. I cannot predict every variable she will encounter. I cannot shield her from every instance of cruelty or unfairness the world has to offer. But I can ensure she never has to question the stability of the ground she walks on. She takes a sip of her apple juice and hums a quiet, unfamiliar melody. The sound fills the kitchen, replacing the silence that used to govern my existence. The spreadsheet of my life has been permanently altered. The predictable geometry replaced by a vibrant, unpredictable human element. Perhaps the greatest lesson is accepting that the most valuable things we leave behind are the ones we cannot mathematically quantify. We spend our days trying to calculate the exact cost of our choices, trying to predict the outcome of every decision. But eventually, the numbers fade. The ledgers are archived and the bank accounts are closed. What remains is the echo of a quiet promise kept in the dark. It is the memory of a hand holding yours when the world turned upside down. We build our homes not with wood and drywall, but with the fierce, unspoken determination to be the sanctuary someone else desperately needs. And sometimes when the light hits the yellow paint just right, you realize the most profound victories are the ones where nobody hears you win at all.